Alder Keleman Saxena is an environmental anthropologist whose research looks at the links between agricultural biodiversity and food culture, especially in relation to nutritional health in the Bolivian Andes. That highly specific research led to her collaboration with Anna Tsing, Feifei, Zhou, and Jennifer Deger for the online Feral Atlas project, which is an absolute gift to anyone concerned with ecology, but specifically from the perspective of trying to reckon with the impact of human activity on the planet. The book that came out of that digital adventure is called Field Guide to the Patchy Anthropocene, The New Nature. It's a riveting book that sets us up with a variety of different ways of approaching the destruction of nature and its disastrous consequences. Alder's chapter in the Field Guide focuses on a patch that's very familiar to her, Flagstaff, Arizona, and the erratic ways that market capitalism is changing the demographic makeup of Flagstaff at a moment of increasing climate peril. This conversation about climate migration into Flagstaff takes us into the topic of housing, capitalism, and climate impacts, the problem of how to communicate and contextualize climate disasters, and the question of how something like a field guide can encourage us to actually dwell with the idea that human beings are both a geological force and a world-ripping one. I'm thinking a ton about the idea that in the wake of these climate disasters that we're seeing more and more of, like, when will it matter for the public, let's say, or public opinion or political will, that these disasters, these apocalyptic wildfires, for example, are getting more and more intense and destructive. And to me, it comes down to the question of communication. And I really liked how the book did talk about the idea of, for example, systems ruptures and these Anthropocene hotspots that come out of them. And it got me thinking just about sort of the question of whether it's appropriate to leverage hope and say it's not too late, it's not the end of the world, or whether it's more appropriate to use fear. And yeah, I mean, like, I could relate this to the idea of carbon feedbacks as a result of wildfires. To me, like, whether you're willing to communicate that to publics, the idea that there could be something like runaway climate change caused by the release of all this carbon, it's like it's a tester of whether you're willing to scare your audience, basically. How did you confront the problems with referencing, as you say in your chapter for the book, fire, flood, and plague as possible consequences of climate change? I ask because you do seem really aware of these kind of issues around communication and not trying to catastrophize in the midst of catastrophe.
I'm glad it read that way to you. And I should say thanks so much for the invitation and for the kind words about the book. It's nice to be here with you and nice to have the chance to talk about it. I think that is the question that you are bringing up. It hits on something that's been a really sort of central concern and point of conversation among the four of us. So, as you're aware, the book is co-authored with Anna Tsing and Jennifer Deger and Feifei Zhou, and we also work together with a much larger team of people on a digital project called Feral Atlas, which came out in 2020. And we have tried to build those projects to speak to multiple audiences, which is a challenging thing to do. But I think in terms of speaking to an audience, particularly an audience of social scientists, there is an extent to which that feeling of inspiring fear, maybe counterintuitively, is something that we've wanted to lean into a little bit. Because there's and I owe this insight to Anna Tsing. It's not my own, but there's an extent to which the academic social sciences tend to really want to look for human creativity as the source of hope for everything, and sometimes that leads us to look a little bit away from the material conditions that are dangerous to all of us in the environment. So I think there's that register is there very much intentionally. it's something that I grapple with a lot when I think about teaching. Um, and that comes to mind for me personally when teaching undergraduates, particularly about environmental change issues. Um, you're probably aware of this report that the IPCC put out, I think it was in 2018, about what it would take to stall climate change at 1.5 degrees centigrade of warming, which is about the temperature at which they think most small island developing nations are going to go underwater. And they put a time frame on that of 12 years. And for me, that time frame to 2030, thinking about teaching undergraduates, really helped to put a point on this tension between needing to think carefully about solutions, but also with this young cohort of students, I don't want them to wait their turn to be involved. So those are things I think about when I think about that question between how do you project hope, but also how do you motivate people to step up and try to take action.
Hmm. Yeah, 100%. And this interesting, challenge to kind of try and teach toward 2030 is interesting because it really brings, as you kind of pointed to, it brings into focus what's at stake in hope versus fear, where one leans. Because when you're teaching, you kind of have to ask yourself the question: Will hope keep 1.5 degrees within reach?
Hmm.
Will inspiring hope, and maybe it will. Like maybe that's actually what it requires because we're
Hmm.
seeing a level of acquiescence and defeatism at certain levels of government.
Hmm.
Yeah, the whole book, your book, is really it's not like hopeful, but it really it comes out of a hope that attending to place can
Hmm.
be the thing that sort of dislodges the stuckness. And yeah, I'm hoping to kind of explore your connection to Flagstaff,
Hmm.
your direct connection to that place, your experience of wildfires there. Um, and I mean, you write in your chapter on the use of social media to share stories of people who like barely got out alive. We saw
Yeah.
stories like this come out of Maui, here in Nova Scotia. These unusual wildfires last year. There were one harrowing story after another. Um, what sort of like political and psychological effects do you think that sort of mediated form of sharing can have to kind of give people direct access to a patch, a place.
Hmm.
Um, and how much do you think like distance from fire can legitimately be collapsed? Like, do people need to experience it? Basically, do you think that people need to experience these climate impacts directly for the needle to be moved in terms of like mobilization? And is it enough to kind of share these local impacts on a global scale for us to kind of get to a place where
Hmm.
it matters that these things are happening?
Hmm. The first part, I think, um, I can answer maybe by talking a little bit about sort of like the particular nature of Flagstaff social media as I experience it. So Flagstaff,
Mm,
it's a smallish city. It's about 125,000 people in northern Arizona. It's 2 hours north of Phoenix, and it's the kind of the biggest city in this part of the state. Um, I have to preface this by saying that I'm normally pretty ambivalent about social media.
mm,
There are lots of great things about it, but I also feel like it can sometimes work us into a frenzy in a way that I don't find personally very productive. Um, but Facebook apparently for Flagstaff kind of hits this sweet spot of it's the social media platform of choice for people apparently above the age of 30.
yeah,
Um, maybe I'm overestimating. Maybe it's above the age of 35,
maybe.
and there's a large chunk of that demographic in Flagstaff, and it's really good for buying and selling used things,
Of course.
and to some extent can be good for communicating a little bit like next door too, but for like public agencies to communicate about something that's going to happen this weekend.
Hmm.
um, so weirdly, there is a really thriving local and place-based community culture in
Mm-hmm.
Flagstaff's social media. And that to me actually feels positive in to the extent that it turns climate issues into a shared experience in a way that I
Mm-hmm.
think might not be the case if we were relying only on newspaper or um, on the radio, because there is so much of this kind of request for help that people then answered.
Yeah. It really, for me, like, plants the seed of a series of questions about how a local social media culture happens,
Hmm,
and just like pointing to the existence of that is useful for thinking about how like the function of Facebook extends beyond just monetizing attention, which is often how, like, let's say,
yeah.
a certain subset of media studies will think about social media is that you
Hmm,
know all they care about are clicks and eyeballs, and yes, of course that is the
hmm,
case with like platforms and algorithmic media, but what might it mean that in certain places social media is still used as a tool for a different sort of kind of grassroots and motley way of connecting?
hmm.
I'll say that I know there's no guarantee, and to that point, like, your chapter has this really really interesting discussion of the links between like housing, capitalism, and climate impacts. So could you kind of maybe talk about why Flagstaff saw, for example, an influx of people during the so-called Zoom boom of work from
Yeah.
home, rather than like climate migration out of the city, given how many impacts there were? And like you talk about keeping a to-go bag to escape wildfire when necessary.
Just maybe just to like give a, I guess by way of explanation,
Mm-hmm.
um, what happened in Flagstaff. So property values have been high here for a long time because despite the wildfires and the floods, it's actually a very nice place to live. It's
Mm-hmm.
surrounded by ponderosa pine forest, and in the context of Arizona, we're at 7,000 feet. So even when Phoenix is
Mm.
at 120 degrees, we're usually in the mid 90s, which
Is
is
that right?
still pretty. It's
Wow.
pretty comfortable by comparison.
Right.
So there are lots of things that make it a really nice place, and also a vacation destination.
Mm-hmm.
So what happened during that period, and this is all stuff that I'm trying to kind of piece together in more extended writing now, but what I understand to have happened during that period is that um, in California during the peak of the pandemic, when a lot of people were selling houses and sort of moving out of the state because the tech industry was largely working remotely.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of the folks who were part of that movement were coming and buying properties in other places, including Flagstaff. I've heard a lot about this in other parts of the Mountain West. Colorado, I think,
Mm-hmm.
had some similar things happen, and some of them were primary homes, but some of them were also investment properties. So my husband and I were on the housing market at that point. We were looking around, and there was one point where we went and talked with a developer who was building houses, and he told us that 9 out of the last 10 houses he'd sold had been bought all cash by people coming from California, several of them sight unseen, to
Whoa.
give you an
Okay.
idea of what this kind
Right.
of like market frenzy was like.
A hot
Um,
market, yeah.
yeah, really hot
A
market.
hot market in a wildland urban interface that can see a fireball like at any moment,
Precisely.
right?
Yeah,
And this is what's so shocking, yeah, about the instability in this incredibly hot market is that it doesn't
right.
abate in the context of
Yes.
these feral effects, these ecological like
Yeah.
disasters. I'm really interested to see where your writing on this convergence goes. And yeah, I mean, you also in your chapter have this really interesting, like the way it ends was really interesting, with the idea of how climate layers itself into other systems. Really stuck with me coming out of your chapter because it's such a useful like conceptual tool,
Hmm.
right? Like I see it, like climate is getting folded into these other systems because of course it is, right? Maybe it makes sense to rewind a little bit and unpack the experience from a patch of living in that wildland urban interface. As I
Mm.
mentioned, many people have been evacuated from Fort McMurray again. Um, these fires are differently intense. When you've experienced them, um, what has that experience been like?
The fire that I talk about in the chapter, I actually,
Mm,
I'm located on the other side of town. So the wind was pushing it the opposite direction from where I live.
mm,
Um, but I think it's, so maybe to zoom actually way, 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 way out.
mhm,
Um, I've lived in Flagstaff for about 5 years now, but I grew up actually in Washington State, in central Washington. And there's fire there too, and has been for a long time. And I'm maybe a little bit extra attuned to that because my dad was a wildland firefighter. He
mm.
spent his career with the U.S. Forest Service, and the summers he was
Wow.
usually out on a fire once the season started.
Mm,
Um,
mhm.
so I think um, there's a regularity to it when you spend time in landscapes that are fire mediated, ecologies that are fire mediated, that I think is both a little bit soothing and then also um, can be unsettling when you think about it in the context of the possibility of these big emergency kinds of fires. So I remember not too long after that big fire that I described in the chapter that burned down something like 100 structures,
Mhm.
um, we saw a plume of smoke to the west of our neighborhood, and all of the neighbors went out, and we kind of watched it and
Mhm.
speculated on what was going to happen, and what color was the smoke, and how far away was it, and what was the wind like that day, and
Right.
how worried did we feel. um, and that, to me, I think um, there's something about having to live with both the extent to which these are really normalized experiences that maybe we shouldn't freak out about too much, and also the possibility that you know out of every 100, a certain number of these fires can be catastrophic, both for life and for infrastructure.
Mhm.
That tension um, uh, it feels to me an important part of living in this moment. And I think maybe that
Yeah.
also kind of gets to the question that you started with earlier about how do you motivate action, especially given that we are, maybe not everybody, but many of us are living with this experience of the tension between those two things.
Yeah. That tension between kind of the normal and the extreme.
Hmm.
Um, I woke up today. It's a beautiful day, right? Like it's very easy to, as you like convincingly explain in your chapter, um, fall back into this kind of comforting idea that we will return to normal. But the emergence of the extreme is now becoming so much more common in the Pyrocene or Anthropocene
Hmm.
in the era of climate warming. And so I think fire is one way to think about it. The other one is flooding, and you
Hmm.
talk about this, you kind of touch on it, and make the point that like flooding is, yes, a normal but also newly catastrophic experience because
Hmm.
of
Hmm.
how warming is creating a greater accumulation of water in the atmosphere. And so we get these like once in a century type storms.
Right.
um, and it's shocking. It can be truly shocking. But the one thing you point out that I don't think maybe people understand in the context of that shock, like they're just not getting this kind of context, I guess, is the way that the particular porousness of a patch of land determines the level of flooding. Like it makes perfect sense, but
Hmm.
it still bears kind of explanation to say like, hey, if the land is impermeable, if you've paved over everything, then you're going to get more flooding because the water has nowhere to go. Do you feel like that is sort of a good example of the arts of noticing, that Tsing and your co-authors kind of talk about. There's a separate book, right? Arts of
Right,
Noticing on a Damaged Planet, where they kind of
right.
develop this methodology. And could you give us other examples of how the kind of field guide is looking to encourage us to see the environment in these deeper ways?
Yeah, I'm glad you came back around to that because I think, um, you know, well, I think the aim of the book is to get us to look closer at terrifying things. There is also within that an aim to look lovingly at those things,
Sure.
and with attention. As much as this is a sort of like what Anna Tsing has called it is a ruined nature that we're living in,
Sure. Yeah.
it's also still beautiful and awe-inspiring. And even just thinking about, that came to mind as you were discussing these 100-year, 1,000-year rainstorms. Um,
Mm-hmm.
being in the middle of a storm like that is it's really scary, and there's also just something about it that takes your breath away.
True.
So I think the example that you gave of thinking about the porosity of a surface and how that relates to the propensity for a place to flood is that's certainly a good example of this idea of arts of noticing. We've also been talking about it in terms of sort of a renewed hopefully interest in thinking about natural history, but thinking about nature not
Mm.
just being as pristine wilderness, but also all of these sorts of mixed up natures that are all around us.
Yeah.
Um, and for the four of us, the focus has been on thinking about how human built infrastructures interact with lots of other kinds of living things and non-living agents too, like geological agents. So soil in that case is a really, well, I guess it's both living and geological, but it's a
Mm.
really good example. um, Road building too, I think, is thinking about the effects that building that hard, non-porous surface over a vast space has in terms of how quickly you can transport things, what kinds of new things can be introduced to places. So we've been thinking a lot about these sorts of feral entities that some people might easily recognize as like invasive species. And I think those kind of material effects certainly are where we're hoping to help people turn their attention.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, and I love the way that Feral Atlas, the online project, articulates this, right? Like, how do you inspire wonder in the midst of dread? That has always stuck with me. I believe you say, how do we use storytelling to inspire wonder in the midst of dread? Could you speak about this idea of
Mm.
like the usefulness of a place-based argument for getting us out of that debate about like the causes of climate impacts, how clearly you can attribute it to climate change. You know, what's what's useful about this sort of like technique of the patchiness, focusing on the patch.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the way to kind of boil that down would be that there's an argument in the book that um, it's easier to care about a place that you are connected to and have that care motivate action.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so these global statistics about climate, or the larger question of are we in the Anthropocene or not.
Mm-hmm.
Um, it's difficult for people to have an emotional response to that, um, and
Yeah.
also difficult to figure out like how do you get purchase on that in your everyday life.
Mm-hmm.
Especially when I don't know if this will have affected you in the same way, but all of this stuff that's coming out about plastic recycling over
Oh,
the last couple of months and years. I'm part of the generation that like I had the different recycling numbers and what they meant memorized by the time I was in like seventh
my
grade.
gosh, yeah.
So it's been personally very very upsetting to me
It's
to find out
disillusioning.
that that's having
Oh
less
my
of an
gosh.
effect. Yeah,
It's actually infuriating, right? Like it was a
absolutely.
deliberate strategy to sell
Yeah,
more plastics. Disposability being the profit winner or a profit leader, right?
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And that, I mean, that's the place where like that fury, like I find it
Mm,
really motivating, but also, as you've highlighted, I think there's an extent to which it's paralyzing too, because how long will a
Yeah,
class action suit against a corporation take, and is that going to fix the problem?
sure.
So
Yeah,
I think part of the argument about looking carefully at these patches that we inhabit is that there's a space of agency, there's a space of influence, there's a space of interaction that you can slide into more easily by caring about the place and the people that surround you, and then that can connect up to these larger global or planetary phenomena. But that
right.
starting with the local can help.
Yeah, I mean, like, there's a reason why I read that like many cities are vastly outpacing their host countries in terms of like emissions
Hmm.
reduction. So they're just like on a better pace,
Hmm.
presumably because they've been able to connect energy emissions, the climate, and the future. You know, in
Hmm.
a way that doesn't feel purely abstract. I think you're right that it's easier to care about a place you're connected to than an idea that you're perhaps not terribly connected to,
Hmm.
because you're not a scholar and you're not interested in
Right.
semantic arguments, right? Like, you talk in the book about the Anthropocene, the human epoch,
Hmm.
as a historical moment where humans are, you say, both a geological force and a world ripping force.
Hmm.
Um, and there's the briefest semantic engagement with Anthropocene, and you kind of just move on and say, like, this is a term we find useful. Ultimately, like, it's a political argument that the Anthropocene needs to be as short as possible. I like that pithiness. But in terms of this idea of the Anthropocene, do you find it helpful as a thinker, as a human being, to kind of like boil it down to the fact of the Anthropocene is a problem? Like, it's a detonating force.
Yeah.
Let's talk about the fact that it is explosive and destructive.
What I find really useful about it, and it was helpful to me also in reframing some of my own thinking, is that the Anthropocene, I think, is you can understand it as being not just about climate change. And if you read the sort of early writings about it, they proposed CO2 levels in the atmosphere as an indicator of the start date of the Anthropocene. And then there's
Mm,
been a whole bunch of revision that's gone back around that. But that, I mean, to go back to what we were just talking about, um, the problem of plastic pollution
mm-hmm.
is a problem that we could stop emitting carbon tomorrow, but we'd still be stuck with all this plastic in the oceans and the microplastics that are in the rivers and in our bodies and in the polar ice.
Blending into the rock. Yeah,
Right.
yeah.
Yeah. And that, to me, what the term Anthropocene helps to think with is that, despite the fact that my chapter focused on climate, it helps move
Mm-hmm.
beyond a climate reductionist approach.
Hmm.
And I think maybe too that's a way to help connect with some of these local ecological questions, because um, there are a lot of ways that ecological resurgence, or these kinds of encouraging these kinds of Holocene fragments, um, can happen in a local place that don't necessarily have to connect to um, calculating your carbon emissions. So that to me is useful. Weirdly, it's this
Mm-hmm.
huge global term, but there are ways that it can make you think also much more materially and locally.
Yeah, I hadn't thought about that. It does. Yeah, it forces a decision about how you position the human. I think
Hmm.
the Anthropocene, for some, will be a seductive term that indicates like man's kind of dominance technologically of nature, and all this innovation and acceleration
Hmm.
that is a unique capacity of the human. And the term can also displace the human. There's a reason why you say more than human in the text. You also say non-human, but more than
Hmm.
human is interesting. I think thinking about the natural as something supernatural, like outside of human nature.
Hmm.
Um, but personally, like a lot of people, I associate the Anthropocene most with the biodiversity
Hmm.
loss. I wondered if you could maybe speak to the field work that you did in Bolivia, What did you learn in Bolivia about that sort of aspect of the Anthropocene?
Yeah. Um, you phrased that question in a way that has me thinking. So my this is sort of my core personal area of research for a long time has been on agrobiodiversity conservation, which, I'll just say for readers who might not be familiar, is readers, sorry, listeners, is
Both.
it's you know the the conservation of a wide variety of genetic diversity, and particularly, crop varieties, often like heirloom crop varieties within the species, the crop species that we eat. So I've worked on that primarily in Bolivia and in Mexico. And you posed the question in terms of witnessing the end of those sort of life courses, which is not a way that I've thought about it before, and I might back out and answer it slightly differently.
Of course.
What's actually been remarkable, I started working on this topic about 20 years ago, and at that point, a lot of the writing in this field was pitched in terms of thinking about um, why is it that indigenous people or small scale farmers continue to conserve agrobiodiversity even when they have these other technologies, these green revolution technologies and
Right.
improved seeds available to them. And it was all kind of the story that was being told was, obviously these things are going to be lost, but we need to understand why people are still conserving them before they go. And what has felt like it slowly has become apparent to me over a long time of working on this is that actually the seeds that people have, they hold on to tenaciously. They're remarkably resurgent because they function as tools for farmers. They provide ways of farming in landscapes that wouldn't be amenable to high tech farming
Right.
techniques. And they also provide a certain sense of cultural connection and connection to history. So in many ways, the agrobiodiversity story is one, I think, of remarkable persistence in many places in the world. Um, what is uh, challenging, and what I think the farmers that I have known in Bolivia have really been grappling with is that they have these twin pressures from the market, because they've got to sell something to be able to make enough money to send their kids to school and cover things they can't produce themselves. And so they've got that sort of increasing pressure. And then they also have climate change. Primarily where I've worked, what the effect has been to increase pest pressure on varieties that aren't resistant to pests and diseases that come from lower altitudes. So they're finding themselves in these circumstances where varieties that they might have planted in the past just aren't doing as well as they would have. And then especially if those are varieties that don't have high market value, at some point they just say, listen, why am I going to put my energy into this
Right.
if I'm going to lose the crop anyway? So I think there's a lot of really interesting creative work being done in that space to think about how can we maintain diverse life in a place that has historically stewarded it, without asking people to resign themselves to to suffering, to poverty, to food insecurity. And there's interesting work being done by communities, and there's also interesting work being done by people who are professionals in these spaces and really want to work hand in hand with communities to breed pest resistant crops that function at high altitudes, or even sometimes introduce things that work in another place, and maybe could adapt to local climates.
Mm.
Um, so I guess I do find some hope in that.
Yeah. I mean, it's a story of, as you say, persistence,
Mm,
and just resolution, against the homogenizing, kind of totalizing forces of neoliberalism. We could, I think, like totally draw a connection to oil and gas development itself, and the fact that
mm,
you've got governments like the Colombian government saying, like, yeah, we have oil, but we want to leave it in the ground to
mm,
preserve our future. that will cause economic hardship. We need to figure something out. Like, we need
Hmm.
to have an agreement with northern hemisphere countries that are responsible for this emergency, for example, to allow us to strand these assets. So
Hmm.
yeah, I mean, it's like you're just caught in this incredible web that you, I think, convincingly say is only perceivable if you do try and understand it from, as it were, the patch, the situated, embodied place, right?
Hmm.
Of just like trying to figure out socially what your modes of agency are, right? What are the coordinates of what's possible here, right? Here and now. Um, and so I just love that the book is given to the reader as a field guide. And I wondered if you want to kind of elaborate on where that idea came from. I feel like I can guess, given the number of anthropologists at the table. How did the idea of the field guide specifically grow out of the web project that preceded the book, right? Because
Hmm.
that was supposed to be very much like a hands-on experience, right? Of diving
Right.
into this virtual space. How did the field guide, how is the field guide linked to that project?
Yeah, so I'm really glad you asked it that way. So the Feral Atlas is a digital project, and it's built to be ideally an experiential sort of teaching tool.
Mm-hmm.
Um, what we learned in the process of putting that project together is that the internet lends itself to a certain kind of architecture.
Mm.
And we wanted to build a project that felt a little bit labyrinthine, but had an order that you would sort of start to perceive the more time you spent with the project.
Mm-hmm.
Um, then we started working with a group of talented and very patient web developers, thankfully, who explained to us that they couldn't build us a labyrinth. Um, and that was not like that just didn't
Mm.
work with the architecture that they had available to set it up. So we ended up kind of having these categorizing axes that
Mm-hmm.
you can use to navigate the project internally. One is this set of historical detonators. Another is a set of tippers, or these sort of state changing infrastructural moments, or complexes.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and then another is these feral qualities. Um, and if you enter from the back end, from the index, you can navigate through those feral qualities to get to sets of entries that tell you something similar.
Mm-hmm.
Um, if you're in that back index part of the project, there are also these other words that are floating in the background, which are they're sort of phantom feral qualities, or phantom detonators.
Mm.
They're ideas that we had about how to organize the material that didn't end up making the cut, but that could have been just as good. And I think part of the reason that we did that visually was we wanted to sort of indicate that these were meant to be playful categorizations.
Right.
Not they're meant to sort of inspire different ways of looking at things. They're not meant to sort of harden into new categories that everybody should go out and try to repeat forever and ever.
In the
Um,
same way that you're kind of using the word atlas to kind of, I would say, like, queer or destabilize the notion of an atlas or a map, right?
that's right.
I love that
Yeah.
you ran up against the limits of the web's architecture in trying to create the project. It's incredible.
It was sobering. And I guess that to come back to your question about the field guide, we had some of the same questions sort of talking about, because there's a long history, there's a long colonialist history to field guides.
Mm-hmm.
And typically, like a field guide to wildflowers, for example, is a very like, if this, then that, if this, then that. And it's a very sort of like, it hardens knowledge and
Mm-hmm.
material in a way that I think feels strange to most anthropologists.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but I think we intended this to be a field guide in that same sort of sense of like, maybe we could think about a different organizational set of categories through which we could understand the world.
Right. That makes
Yeah.
perfect sense. And it's something that I like thinking about, like the tendency toward categorization, and how it partitions the environment into all these different components that are so obviously
Mm,
interwoven. The question of climate communication, which we've already talked about, is worth coming back to, mainly because there's like this one huge insight in your chapter that I was
mm,
really struck by, that was very helpful for me as a climate communicator, where you say that extreme or unseasonal weather comes regularly, punctuated by
mm,
other unprecedented events. You've kind of already talked about this, right? The tension between the
mm,
normal and the
mm,
extreme. Um, and you say it happens not with the definitive narrative progression of big screen climate disaster films, but dispersed just enough across groups of people and across space and time that it's easy to talk oneself into thinking that things will get back to normal, projecting a storyline of certainty into an uncertain future. But what would normal look like, and who decides? And I think like that is just an extraordinary point, that like it just articulates the problem of time and timing in
mm,
communicating about climate disasters so perfectly. Because I think it underscores the fact that human beings in 2024 face a climate emergency, complex social media cultures that they navigate every
mm,
day, visual culture that overwhelms them,
mm.
and social norms that they may or may not feel, sort of beholden to or pressured by. Um, could you kind of give us a bit more context on this theory that you have, I guess, that because climate impacts don't hit in the formulaic way that a disaster would in a big screen blockbuster, there's a problem when it comes to communicating with appropriate urgency about them, right? Like you don't know when they're coming. So how can you properly keep the disaster in mind?
There's an article that came out right around the time that this book had already gone to press. Otherwise, I would have cited it in the chapter. And right now, unfortunately, I can't remember the name of the author, but I can share it later if you want to put it in your show
Sure, I can
notes.
put it in the show notes. Yeah.
But it was a woman who was an ethnographer who was she was doing research on the perception of climate change among evangelical communities in the
Hmm.
American Southwest. So she was in Arizona and also, I think, in Georgia, I want to say. And what was really interesting was that the word climate fit into a different set of stories for those groups of people. I'm now paraphrasing what she had to say,
Hmm.
but for the people that she was interviewing and quoting, um, climate change worked into a, a Christian critique of the hubris of science. And particularly, they saw in climate predictions a sort of over determinism on the part of scientists, which was out of line because um, really we should just stand back and not get in the way of God's will and think that we as humans are able to
Hmm.
have an
Hmm.
influence.
Hmm.
And I found that article so interesting, and to some extent, I think this gets back to the question of the patch
Hmm.
that we were talking about earlier, because there's a way where the story, the overarching narrative about climate, to some people, fits into a story that they reject.
Hmm.
Um, Whereas if we think about cleaning up a riverbed or water conservation, sometimes those are not quite as confrontational to people.
Very true.
They're easier to build coalitions around. Um, I mean, that gets us back to the challenge of the fact that we're in a moment where, like, we need large scale collective action, and climate communication, at least in my understanding experience, is really focused on that larger scale
Often,
piece.
yeah.
But in terms of the question you're posing about storytelling, that felt to me like a really strong example of the ways that these stories are so difficult to articulate in ways that resonate with everyone.
No, that is, I find that question of the kind of intersection of, religion, spirituality and climate consciousness really interesting, and it's in some ways a pretty logical like comparison to talk about the sublime size of the climate crisis in relationship to this feeling of being overwhelmed by
Mm.
that form of kind of theological sublime. um, the wildfires are a fixation for me because I find it hard to believe that people wouldn't experience just a level of like existential dread and fury
Mm.
in the wake of these sorts of impacts. Um, but you kind of the last thing you said reminded me of a really brilliant excerpt from the book that I wanted to cite. You're talking about how the climate communications is often focused on the global. You give the reader a useful way of understanding the relationship between the patch and the planet, or the local and the global, in terms of fossil fuels, where you write that burning fossil fuel is patchy. It's concentrated, particularly in northern cities, where industry as well as transportation create great clots of carbon dioxide. That
Mm.
term, great
Mm.
clots of carbon dioxide. Although it
Mm.
takes some time, these clots dissipate around the globe, right? This idea of carbon dioxide being well mixed in the atmosphere, creating a planetary condition of overheating. You're also saying, though, at a certain point in the book, that you're lumping the burning of fossil fuels in with nuclear energy. So I guess I'm
Yeah.
wondering, conceptually, why you decided to blend these two industrial kind of infrastructures, the nuclear and the fossil driven. Yeah.
That's really so. Part of the putting together of the fossil fuels and nuclear is that um, we it comes back to that architecture of the internet question, that we needed to group entries, and there's a burn is one of our grouping categories, and
That makes
there
sense.
were just a couple of things on nuclear that fit with fossil fuels, so they were easy to develop a story around. I guess the one other thing that maybe I feel like I'm not on terribly shaky ground saying is the challenge of nuclear is what can go wrong, I think if you look at the history of human-built infrastructure over the last 500 years, we have a lot of examples of what can go wrong and how things can go badly wrong. So I can't speak for the rest of the crew, but my feeling about it personally is that the stakes are so high that I'm keen to explore other options.
Yeah. It's a strange place to conclude our discussion, to think about nuclear, but I think it's also kind of perfect in the sense that, like, if you look at a particular patch, Ontario in Canada, for example, and you start to think about like what is their energy mix, it's more than 50% nuclear energy. And if you start to like project into a future of warming and loss and damage and so on and so forth, and you kind of factor in just how ubiquitous nuclear power production is, it should fill you with some like anxiety to know that like as things become more unstable, you have these sources of power that could be completely catastrophic. The book it's like a remarkable resource, but it's also very fun to read, which is very difficult to do. So congrats on getting that put together. And
thanks, that's so kind of you.
collaboration is not easy either. I mean, it seems like you've got a really incredible group of curators and authors, though. So I hope everybody finds it and reads it. It's really, really, an actual page turner of an academic text. So,
Thank you.
kind of a rarity in some ways in a fairly dry field.
I sure appreciate you taking the time to look at it so carefully and to talk about it.
It was my pleasure.